Hello everyone. Catamarans versus monohulls. Which is the best? Well, the real question is, which is the best for you? And in this video, we're going to talk about all the different considerations that you should really consider before purchasing either one, because it's an important decision and a big investment. So stay tuned for all the answers. Welcome to the Catamaran Cruising Channel, where we share helpful knowledge, tips, product reviews, and info on sailing, cruising, and boat building to help you get out there and actually live the dream on the water. We are Carly and Garrett, and we built our catamaran over 20 years ago and have 20,000 miles of adventures in the Pacific Northwest, Mexico, the Sea of Cortez, the Hawaiian Islands, and crossing the Pacific Ocean twice. Subscribe below to start your adventure. We want to see you out there. Okay, now the question, catamarans versus monohulls. Let's dive into all the different considerations, the differences, the similarities, and what you should really consider before you make that big investment into one boat or the other. So let's just talk about sailing. And though they fundamentally both have sails, their motion through the water is quite a bit different. A monohull, as you know, heels over 20, 30, 40 degrees, depending on the type of boat. And a lot of the things that we normally do, you can't do when you're heeled over like that. So monohull sailors, when they go out sailing, nothing is left on the counters. Everything has to be put away and secured. Now, in a catamaran, basically if you're anchoring or you're moving, there's not a whole lot of difference. And one prime example is when Carly and I sailed across the Pacific to Hawaii and sailed back. It was a total of 56 days, and there was only one day that we could not leave our coffee cups on the counter. The other days we just went about our normal routine. And in fact, we played Mexican train dominoes every day except for that one day where it was just a little bit too bouncy. So there's a big difference in the way they sail and the way the comfort level is. And so we kind of got used to this, that, you know, when you're level sailing, it's just life as normal. Now, the motion is quite a bit different too, because you're heeled over in a monohull, and because of the weight of the keel, the motion is much more kind of gradual as you go over the waves. But the pendulum effect that can sometimes happen can cause seasickness for many people. Now, in a catamaran, the motion is more of a bobbing nature, and so it's quite a bit different and not nearly as tiring, because many times in a monohull, when you're sailing at those angles and you're sitting, it's like being in a perpetual sit-up position, and it can be very tiring on your core muscles because you're always at these angles and you're always fighting things. Where in a catamaran, it's just walking around, there's a little bit of motion, but it's not tiring in nearly the same way, and that's a big difference that we found. Now, an important point is what is the difference at anchor? And as we know, most boats are at anchor most of the time, especially when cruising long distances. They do a passage and they might take them 10-20 days, like it took us 24 days to go to Hawaii. But when we were in Hawaii, 4 months we were at anchor. Well, this is where a catamaran really is so much more comfortable. Many of the anchorages you go to on the exposed coasts are really open bays with swell coming in, and a catamaran will just slowly bob up and down with the swells. Life is normal. But in a monohull, depending on the period of those swells, you'll be going one side, two side. And if Carly ever watches this video, she'll probably start getting seasick, because that would sometimes happen. We'd go and visit some of our friends who are anchored in a bay, and we go onto their boat, and it's oh. And we look at each other saying, how can they stand it? And so we find that that is one of the big advantages of catamarans, is that they're just so much more comfortable at anchorage. Now, if you're in a really super protected bay, like we have many of those places here in the Pacific Northwest where there's no ripple, well, there's no difference. But when you're cruising out in the more open areas, swell is always a factor, and it's a big consideration. Now, another point is relative to safety. And safety is a multifaceted question. And one of the things that people say about catamarans is, oh, what happens if you should flip over? And the reality is that for cruising catamarans, the chances of flipping over and going inverted is very, very improbable. They're usually, the sail plans are kind of made in a very conservative way, and so it really takes extreme type of negligence really to be able to flip a catamaran. So that safety consideration really has never even crossed our minds, and in all the sailing we've done on our boat, we've never felt that the boat was going to in any way flip over. Now, if you have a racing boat, a catamaran that you see, in the America's Cup, where they're in these carbon fiber boats, with huge sail plans, 1,000, 2,000 square feet. Yes, those do flip over, and a lot of you probably have seen those very exciting videos where they sort of slowly go up and then they go inverted. Well, that's not a cruising catamaran, and you don't really have to worry about that. So the thing about a monohull, though, which has always been a concern to us, is that they sink, and you have thousands of pounds of lead, and any type of hole, a broken through hull, clip coming up, and water's coming through, you have literally minutes to be able to fix the problem. Now, on our boat, the boat is buoyant. You could drill holes into the hull. We have watertight compartments, and you could drill probably 20 holes in the boat, and the boat would just still sit there because it is basically buoyant by nature. There's no lead in it. And so for us, that's a real safety factor, because if you perhaps have something more catastrophic, let's say you bumped into a whale or something and it made a big hole, well, it would be kind of very unnerving, and we would have to do various things, but we wouldn't lose the boat. But in a monohull, you get a big enough hole, like a 2-3 inch hole, and really you have literally minutes to be able to stop it, and that can be very difficult, especially if it's in rough conditions. Now, another interesting point, difference with catamarans versus monohulls, is anchoring. And anchoring, because of your draft, can make many more opportunities available to you. So our catamaran draws 2.5 feet. Many of the production ones are 3-4 feet, versus monohulls, which tend to be 5, 6, 7, 8 feet. And so that really kind of restricts where you can actually anchor. And so many times when we go into busy anchorages, we can go right out to the corners where there's space and nobody goes there because the water is fairly shallow. So it gives us many more options when we're anchoring. Another factor is that a catamaran, most of them have what we call mini keels, low aspect ratio keels, which run 6, 8, 10 feet along the hulls on the bottom. And in our particular case, if we have scouted out the particular bay that dries out, we can go into the bay and actually at low tide just dry out. Now, you can't do this unless you've actually literally walked the bay at low tide, because you have to know there's no rocks and there's no obstacles there. So just because there's green on the chart and looks like it dries out, we would never try to dry out in that. But we have a couple spots on the BC coast where we've scouted it out, and we routinely take our boats in there and anchor, and then when the tide goes out, we're just sitting on the mud. Well, obviously we're the only ones there, and so it gives us a lot of privacy and creates some unique spots that no one else can go to. Another question that comes up quite a bit is, how do they sail upwind? What's their performance? Now, monohulls, as a general rule, their performance upwind is very good. And catamarans, as a cruising catamaran, where you have these long, low aspect ratio keels, the performance upwind is not as good. Now, you can get dagger boards, which go down 6-8 feet, and that can give you quite a bit of performance. And there are several boats, production boats, that do have that, the minority, however, and that does increase the performance upwind. But with that comes the problem that if you ever hit something like a log and you're doing 8 or 10 knots and you've got this board that sticks down 8 feet into the water, you'll either shear off the board or it'll push the board right into the box and break something inside the boat. So here on the Pacific Northwest, it's very beautiful, all the forests and so forth, but unfortunately the logs get into the rivers, they flow out to the ocean, and they are an ongoing obstacle. And as well, you have a lot of tugboats which are taking these log booms from logging operations, and so hitting a log is not unusual. So here, having low aspect ratio keels is the best way to go. But you do give up some performance going upwind. So a monohull will definitely do better going upwind. But when you're cruising, the expression is, gentlemen don't go to weather. Well, we try to, pick your passages. Sailing down the west coast of North America, you're going with the primarily northwest winds. When you sail to Hawaii, you're with the trade winds. When you're coming back, same thing, you're in the trade winds, and then you're into the westerlies. And you're trying to sail downwind most of the time. And all the cruising routes, either it's the Coconut Run through the South Pacific, you're all trying to go with the prevailing winds. And so you're going to be sailing downwind. And so the upwind versatility of a monohull is not really needed in the same way. And as well, one of the big considerations, especially sailing downwind between a catamaran and a monohull, is the motion in the boat. A monohull, when it's on a close reach heading upwind, it's in a consistent angle and it's bouncing up and down, and it's not too bad, the motion. But when they're sailing downwind and they start getting into this corkscrew type of motion, they can be very uncomfortable. But in a catamaran, sailing dead downwind is about the best point of sail because all the motion is reduced and it's sort of like dreamlike sailing. And so we would try to, pick our passages so that we're always sailing in that configuration. So in terms of speed, catamarans can be a little bit faster than a monohull depending on how they're sailed. Because we were sailing primarily just the two of us, would sail in a pretty conservative manner, and we would try to keep our boat speed between 5 and 7 knots. And you think, oh well, can't catamarans do 10, 12 knots? Yes, they can. The only problem is that when you're at those higher speeds, you have to be fully attentive to the boat. You have to be there with, watching the sheets, the main sheet, and so forth. Because if the boat gets overpressed, now you're not doing, 8 to 12 knots. You're doing all of a sudden 15 knots, and now you're getting the motion and the speed is a little bit out of control. So we would always sail a boat fairly conservatively, and so basically the autopilot steering the boat, and we're just sort of managing the boat, keeping a watch for traffic, but we don't have to be on the sheets ready at any instant to release a sheet if the boat gets overpressed. And when you're doing a long passage of 3 days, 2 days, 25 days across to Hawaii, you can't be on guard 24 hours a day. The stress will just burn you up. And when you only have 2 people, you have to make sure that things are very easygoing and you're just sort of in a relaxed frame of mind to be able to enjoy the trip. Otherwise, it becomes very, very stressful. Another important consideration is the view. Catamarans have a bridge deck, and that view from the seating area, in our case we have a galley up, so Carly can see the view while she's cooking, sitting on the dinette. We have a full view 360 degrees around the boat, and that creates a lot of openness, especially when we're sailing and also when we're at anchor, because then we're basically enjoying the scenery. So many of the monohulls, you have to go down, several steps, and you're down into this dungeon, and there's some small windows. If you're standing up, you can see out of, but doesn't even compare to the view that we have in a catamaran. Now, many of the newer monohulls are coming up with, skylights, and they do this sort of semi-elevated saloon so that you can get a better view. And so it's the difference on some of the newer boats is not as big. But catamarans just have this gorgeous view all in that one level. Now, another consideration is moorage. And if you're staying at a marina, your options with a monohull are much better because they'll always be able to fit you into a slip. Where with a catamaran, because of the width, our boat is almost 18 feet wide, and we only have a single outboard engine, our maneuvering is a little bit precarious at times. And so when we would go into marinas, we make sure we have to be on an outside slip finger. We don't go maneuvering down the fingers. That's just too precarious. Now, if you have a larger catamaran with 2 diesel engines, yes, you have more steerage, but most of the slips aren't made for 20-foot wide boats. So you're still going to be going on the outside of the marina. So that's a problem, and you have to be able to be a little bit more creative in finding more solutions. Right now we have our boat out in Ladner, BC at a small private dock with about a dozen boats. It's not a marina per se, and we have like an outside slip, easy to just drive in, back out. There's no problem there. So that's a problem, and in certain areas you may have a hard time finding a slip for a catamaran. Mind you, when you're cruising, we hardly stayed at a marina. Out of the 2 years we were out cruising to Mexico and Hawaii, we were probably 1 month out of the 24 total that we were actually at a dock or marina. We just anchored off, found the spot, and then would just dinghy back and forth into shore. Another point is windage, and this is relative to moorage in a way. If you're going into a marina and you're trying to maneuver through it, well, a catamaran sits on top of the water, and so wind blows you around much more, and it creates a little bit more difficulty maneuvering. Where monohull, with its long keel, it's in the water and it's not affected by windage in the same way. Now, another consideration with catamarans versus monohulls is loading the boat. And because of the general nature of catamarans, they're built lightly. Their performance is much more subject to being reduced if they're overloaded. And so you put too much weight on a catamaran and the boat starts sinking lower in the water, and then the performance deteriorates. Your bridge deck clearance from the bottom of your bridge deck to the water reduces, you get more slapping, the boat isn't as sort of responsive, it's sort of mushy in the water. And so on our boat, we have a lot of space, but we can't really put everything you could cram into it because the boat performance would deteriorate. So you have to be a little bit more selective on how you load the boat. And so some things you may not be able to take with you. You may have to have a water maker instead of having just tanks. So there are some considerations, how much fuel you take. Monohull, you can have big tanks. More tanks the better because it adds to the stability of the boat. So that loading factor is always a consideration. And some of these higher performance catamarans like the Outremer out of France and so forth, very high performance, very narrow hulls, but they don't have the payload capacity. And so if you're cruising long distance, you can't do the same things. Now, if you have a lagoon catamaran which has really wide hulls, that becomes a kind of a moot point because you can put so much more have so much more buoyancy from those bigger hulls. But to get the boat to move, it has to have a really big sail plan, and so that becomes harder to operate and handle. And that's a consideration with when you're only 2 crew members. And that is the norm for people who are cruising long distances. It's most of the time just husband and wife, and really the smallest crew member has to be able to handle everything on the boat while the partner, which is the man, is sleeping, because you can't be waking the person up every time you have to do something because there's too much weight involved. And in some of these bigger catamarans, I look at them and I look, wow, that's a big mast. I would not be very keen on, trying to reef that in the middle of the night when it's rainy and windy on my own. And so if I can't do it, well, Carly can't do it. And then every time if she's on watch, then I would have to do it. So these are some of the considerations on, the catamaran versus monohull decision. We love our catamaran. We couldn't go back to a monohull, even a powerboat monohull. It would have to be a catamaran powerboat if we ever made that type of change, because we're so used to that level sailing, beautiful view, and that's what fits for us. Another point is availability. And the catamaran market over the last 20 years has really just grown because of these considerations we've been chatting about. And so there's a lot more production boats out there. However, in the used market, there's not as many. And with the recent hurricanes of the last couple of years, some of the catamaran charter fleets were just totally wiped out in the Caribbean. And so there's not as many on the market. So there is a premium to get into a cruising catamaran of 35, 38 feet, like a Lagoon 38. You might be looking at 150 to 200,000 US. Well, for under 100,000, there's a lot of monohull choices, and that would get you out on the water. But not only that, be able to do an extensive long-term cruise. So you are paying a premium for the catamaran experience, but in our minds, it's totally worth it. And so those are some of the considerations. So whichever boat you pick, catamaran, monohull, it's going to get you on the water, and you'll be able to enjoy the cruising lifestyle and all the beauty, the joys, and the adventure that we all need as human beings. So have a great day, and bye from Garrett and Carly. So if you'd like to learn more about the cruising lifestyle, tips, techniques, product reviews, and everything about catamarans, subscribe below.